After the Italians dropped out of the war, a separate peace for Britain would have seen America joined with Russia to fight against Germany and England and Japan. And that would have been a formidable struggle indeed, so the atom bomb dropped on Japan had saved the planet from a truly gargantuan fight when Britain had once again turned on its allies in the middle of a war to fight alongside the enemy, a tactic that had brought them such enormous success in the past. At the end of Hitler's war, the U.S. had 3 times the industrial capacity of Russia and 10 times that of Britain, and the devastation in Russia was immense, with 26 million of their people killed and 1,700 towns and 70,000 farming villages destroyed, and 30,000 factories and 6 million buildings had been blown up, along with 60 major power plants and 3,000 oil wells. In Russia, the Germans had killed 20 million cows, hogs, and sheep each, and as the Germans retreated from Russia, they'd torn up 35,000 miles of railroad tracks, hoping to slow the coming payback as the Russians began moving towards Berlin. When Ike came to meet with the Russian army occupying Berlin, he was surprised by the amount of ox-drawn wagons the Red Army had brought with them, and the U.S. promised to stay in Berlin after the war to protect the Germans from the British, and denazification programs would be run by Americans. Civilian officials friendly to the Americans suffered a plague of clandestine assassinations in many German towns, especially in Hanover, purportedly done by Nazis, but certainly not by anyone in a recognizable uniform. Hitler's decision to form a great offensive against the tempting, thinly held front of the Ardennes, the scene of his 1940 victory, had one unexpected result. It delayed a planned Allied offensive and thus permitted the Russians to launch their attacks to the Oder River against greatly weakened opposition and advance farther into Germany. Had Hitler sent his mobile reserve to the east, rather than into the Ardennes, it is entirely possible that the Western Allies and Russians would have met somewhere in Poland, the Bitter Woods, page 469. Had Germany surrendered after the Bulge, then half of Poland would have been spared being overrun by the Soviet Red Army, but Hitler had his heart set on Operation Nordwind, Northwind, and Ike strung the British along until April by giving them American troops and appearing to cooperate with the British plans. But when the time came to openly break with the British, Ike did not hesitate. Hitler's hope that he could repeat the exploits of Frederick the Great of Prussia in dividing the alliance facing him proved to contain a germ of substance, but in the end that hope was defeated, just as Hitler erred in assuming that the Supreme Commander would be required to consult Washington before radically altering his strategic plans, just as he erred in underestimating the competence of the Allied command and the fighting qualities of the American soldier. He erred in thinking that one powerful attack could split what he regarded as a weak coalition. The Bitter Woods, page 392. The German Navy had basically pulled out of the war in 1944 after the Admiral Canaris business in the 20th of July plot, and the Kriegsmarine had been full of Swedes and was heavy with Viking blood, while the army was driven by Bavarians and various mountain folk. And after the Hesse betrayal, the Luftwaffe had been largely discredited and shunted aside. Speer and Hitler had been putting their money on the V-1 and V-2 rockets, along with other wonder weapons, such as huge railway guns that took resources away from the more mundane necessities, such as food and clothing and gasoline and medical supplies, and the result was that the Luftwaffe had been unable to stop the carpet bombing from the air. At Stalingrad, the German soldiers had gone into the city to get out of the wind, and the battle fought block by block, building by building, may have worn them down month by month, but it kept them from freezing right away out on the prairie. Mostly, Hitler had buckled down to his political intrigues with the British, indulging in their fantastical historical recreations, and Hitler was exceptionally gullible to this manipulation, due to his fascination with the writings of Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, who wrote poetry about eternal recurrence and the power of destiny, ideas that swung right along with the drugs Hitler had been taking, and all that fancy talk and those empty promises kept Hitler focused on trying to ruin Mother Russia for his British co-conspirators rather than doing what was best for the fatherland. Chief Müller. Many of these officers were involved in the conspiracy, and many wanted to join with the Russians against the West. Stauffenberg himself was very pro-Russian. I personally was of the belief that General Berger had connections with the communists, but I could not prove it, and Himmler would hear nothing bad about Berger, and became so angry that I was temporarily forced to abandon my pursuit of him. Q. Stauffenberg was the man who planted the bomb, wasn't he? Chief Müller. Yes, he was the actual ringleader, and he was in touch with the Soviets. There was liaison, you know, between this group, which was certainly an agency of the Russian intelligence, and the dissident groups in the upper levels of the army. These gentlemen are more interested in a man's ancestors than his political convictions. Don't misunderstand me. There are very many brave and loyal officers, most of them in fact, but many of the very top generals, mostly aristocrats and junkers, who were either infected with pro-Russian sentiments or were sabotagers of Hitler for reasons of class pride, got their fingers into the plot at one level or another. We followed up on all the information we had, and the Soviet thread came up almost at once. Gestapo Chief, page 145 through 54. You can train a Russian soldier not to betray the division or regiment, but you cannot prevent him from talking about such natural and self-evident things as, for example, that Alaska must be taken from the Americans because they made the Tsar drunk before getting him to sign it away, or that after the defeat of Japan, Russia was to get the whole of Manchuria, that after the defeat of the fascists, i.e. the Germans, it would be necessary to destroy the capitalists in Europe, i.e. the English, and to take Switzerland as they went along, because it was harboring all the Nazi leaders. These things were so self-evident that they must be obvious to everyone. They lay in the natural course of justice, so what could be the harm in talking about them? Comes The Comrade by Alexandra Orma, New York, William Morrow and Company, Inc., 1949-1950, page 133. Vladivostok was right above the border with North Korea, and Vladivostok was Russia's only port on the Pacific Ocean. And when Stalin heard about the secret British presence in North Korea at the end of Hitler's war, he quickly moved the Red Army to Vladivostok because he needed to keep North Korea from becoming a threat to Russia. And thanks to Kim Philby, Stalin was well aware of the duplicity being undertaken by the British after their ignominious failures and humiliating losses at the end of Hitler's war, and Stalin had not declared war on Japan until the 9th of August in 1945 because he could not have beaten the Germans if he also had to fight the Japanese. And in the summer of 1945, new Japanese torpedo rocket fighters were being built, using COOLIE labor deep within tunnel complexes in Japan, and the tunnels were deep enough to survive nuclear bombs. The Japanese jet airplanes were more advanced than the new German jets, and they had hundreds of these airplane factories, and when democracy was finally forced on Japan, there were over 10,000 jet airplanes ready to go just as soon as the fuel was delivered to get them into the air. But there had been no fuel to power the new Japanese jet fighters yet. Stalin had made the deal with FDR about the 38th parallel, but not with Churchill, who might still have some cards up his sleeve, and Stalin had been assured by that the British were kept out of the loop when Truman dropped the bomb on Hiroshima on the 6th of August, and Stalin believed the Americans were no longer working with Britain because the British had their hearts set on a land invasion of Japan, and they had maps and manifests on the drawing board when the first live atomic bomb test proved to be successful. 17 July 1945. Started with usual work in the office, then COS Chief of Staff, at which we discussed new papers received by the Secretariat from the Americans. The first was the American reply to our desire to participate in the direct attack on Japan. The reply was far better than we had hoped for, and the offer is accepted in principle. The second was a question of command in the Pacific. There I foresee more trouble ahead. We want a greater share in the control of the strategy in the Pacific, and they are apparently reluctant to provide this share. War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 706. It is interesting to note Winston's reaction and my counter-reactions to the atomic bomb news. Winston's appreciation of its value in the future international balance of power was certainly far more accurate than mine, but what was worrying me was that with his usual enthusiasm for anything new, he was letting himself be carried away by the very first and rather scanty reports of the first atomic explosion. He was already seeing himself capable of eliminating all the Russian centers of industry and population without taking into account any of the connected problems, such as delivery of the bomb, production of bombs, possibility of Russia also possessing such bombs, etc., etc. He had at once painted a wonderful picture of himself as the sole possessor of these bombs and capable of dumping them where he wished, thus all-powerful and capable of dictating to Stalin. War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 710. Dictating to Stalin! 24 July, 1945. Thus finished our combined Chiefs of Staff meeting. In Berlin! Where we had never hoped to meet in our wildest dreams in the early stages of this war, and now that we are here I feel too weary and cooked to even get a kick out of it. It all feels flat and empty. I am feeling very, very tired and worn out. It had been much the easiest of any of our meetings. The old battles were done and finished. No more battles to stop Americans from crossing the Channel too early. No more battles to lead them to North Africa and keep them there. No more battles to bring them along through Sicily to Italy, and no more battles to hold them in Italy till the critical moment. All that was by now past history. There now only remained the Pacific problems to coordinate. And as in this theater they had always been much more of a predominant partner, it was more a matter of conforming to their strategy. War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 711. 2 August 1945. Finally long discussion with Simpson on plans for our imperial expedition for the invasion of Japan with a corps of 1 British, 1 Canadian, and 1 Australian division. War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 714 and 15. 9 August 1945. Quite a long COS Chief of Staff with planners in discussing final actions necessary to put into action the preparation of the corps for the invasion of Japan. Ibid. Even when the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki on the 9th of August, Japan would not surrender until the 15th of August, and the day before Japan surrendered, the Soviets landed in North Korea to do their part against the Japanese, and Stalin quickly cleared Japan out of the north and stopped at the 38th parallel in Korea the day after the Japanese surrender had been agreed. The Japanese were still in control of South Korea, where the Americans were supposed to do their part, and the Red Army had done the usual raping and pillaging, but the Koreans insisted that the behavior of the Russians was not nearly as bad as the Japanese and the Germans. It would not be until the 8th of September that Truman sent General John Reed Hodge to South Korea to administer his half, and Hodge came in with the Incheon landing, where several thousand Japanese governors were still in South Korea, and Hodge had fought in the Pacific Theater and had been involved in the invasion of Okinawa and had come to respect the Japanese, and to his credit, it was hard for Americans to tell the difference between the Koreans and the Japanese at first, but that would quickly change. Hodge had started appointing Japanese leaders because he noticed that the Koreans were more favorable to communism, while the Japanese were decidedly not. And when the Russians heard this, they came to Busan to save Korea from the Japanese and from the Americans, who were too stupid to know the difference between Japanese and Koreans. And Stalin had no choice but to confront the Americans because his friend FDR was dead. The Koreans had learned about communism from the Chinese, who'd been helping them fight the Japanese during Hitler's war, and the Japanese in Korea had not heard about the Japanese surrender, or they simply disbelieved it, and the Soviet invasion of North Korea helped to convince the Japanese that the war had indeed been lost, and so the Russians went a long way towards ending Hitler's war for the Koreans. The Japanese and the British had landed together at Vladivostok in the Great War in 1918 while the Czechs were marching towards Vladivostok, and the Czechs had taken over the Trans-Siberian Railway in June of 1918 and met up with the Whites, then went to the Volga and seized Ekaterinburg and moved back towards eastern Russia. But the Reds fought back and forced them into Siberia, and the Reds tried to take back Vladivostok, but were stopped by 75,000 Japanese soldiers and the other troops sent there by France, Great Britain, Canada, and the United States. With that experience under his belt, Stalin had been helping to promote communism in China because he thought it would go a long way towards helping them to keep out the British. And the Whites would leave Vladivostok by early 1919, but the Japanese stayed for over 4 years, and Russia would not get Vladivostok back until October of 1922. The Japanese had not attacked Russia at the beginning of Hitler's war, but had moved into the Dutch East Indies to use them as an oil supply because the Americans had cut them off. And the British told America not to worry about the Japanese because the British could monitor them with the magic purple code-breaking machine. The British had been telling the Americans that Japan was going to attack Russia, and Churchill had spoken of it as often as he talked about Hitler. But FDR knew better than to take Churchill's drunken rambling and whining harangues too seriously, so he had failed to pass that information on to Stalin, and FDR had embargoed oil to Japan to prevent them from attacking Russia in the first place. When the Japanese refused to leave Korea after Hitler's war, the Americans went over to convince them to go back home, and Ike was elected in 1952 and quickly put an end to the Korean War. Ike served 2 terms with Nixon as his vice president, and JFK was elected in 1960 after Ike. And when JFK was murdered, he was replaced by Lyndon Johnson, who would expand the Vietnam War, and Nixon would be elected to be the President of the United States 8 years after JFK's election. Both Nixon and JFK had tried to bring some sanity to America by cutting back on the CIA's endless wars, and Nixon would be forced out of office in an FBI sting operation as soon as he brought peace with honor to Vietnam. Ike had won the Electoral College vote in 1952, 442 to 89, and he won a Republican majority in both the House and the Senate, with Nixon as the tiebreaker in the Senate. And Ike and Nixon did even better in 1956, winning 457 to 73 electorally. And Ike proposed and pushed through the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960s, for which the Democrats would later take credit. It had been Ike who sent the 101st Airborne to Little Rock to escort the little black kids into the white schools, and Martin Luther King had written Ike a thank you note for that. Ike had seen the skill and competence of the black soldiers under his command during Hitler's war, and along with FDR had pushed for equality as a matter of national security. These policies of Ike and FDR were expanded in the peacetime economic boom after the war, and the economy was fueled by the Republicans until the Democrats took over in 1960. And along with their stifling economic measures, the Democrats brought a tsunami of drugs from Southeast Asia and from India so they could implement the socialism of the not-so-great society. After Hitler's war, the biggest digging machine ever built had started strip mining coal in Ohio, and it was called the Big Muskie and was 22 stories high and longer than 1.5 football fields, and it used as much electricity as a city of 100,000 people. The oil companies were fighting over the production of nuclear energy while the Rosenbergs were sentenced by a jury of 11 men and 1 woman. And none of what they'd given the Russians had been scientifically important. People were abnormally afraid of Russia because they'd been looking at a non-Mercator map in their textbooks, a projection that made the country look abnormally large, and the truth was that the Great Cold War was kept from going hot by dozens of spies sharing secrets with the other side, ensuring that each knew the other's formidable capabilities, and both Russia and America were completely aware of what the other was doing thanks to these many spies and double agents. Russian spies told the CIA the truth about the Koreans and swore it wasn't Soviet expansion, that Stalin was only interested in socialism in one single country, which was actually national communism, and when Trotsky and his international communists were expelled from Russia in January of 1929, Trotsky had first taken refuge in Constantinople, then tried Norway, and had ultimately gone to Mexico. In the first days of the war with the whites, Lenin had directed his trusted Trotsky to go to Mexico to scope out the extent of British hegemony over Mexican oil. And when Trotsky showed up back in Mexico in 1940, the British had him killed, then cooked up the story that Stalin was behind Trotsky's murder to discredit the Russians, and Trotsky's reports about British plans for the exploitation of Mexico were destroyed. Lenin had met Trotsky in London in 1902 when Lenin had been learning to speak English. And Trotsky had preferred America over England because he spoke German and was able to get around in America with it. The communists had not troubled to make it easy for the British. At a Congress of the Peoples of the East held in Baku in September 1920, Zinoviev had said that the Comintern, quote, turns today to the people of the East and says to them, brothers, we summon you to a holy war, first of all against the British imperialism. At this there were cries of jihad, jihad, and much brandishing of picturesque oriental weapons. However, Moscow followed up this colorful beginning in Asian foreign relations, not with an Eastern crusade, but instead, in February 1921, with treaties with Afghanistan and Persia, where British interests were considerable. 20th Century Russia, page 233. The year after Trotsky was murdered, the U.S. had to settle a dispute between the Mexican government and private oil companies in the fall of 1941, and the U.S. made a cash offer that was not acceptable to the British because it excluded managerial control over workers striking for higher wages. And the following month, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. It would not be until October of 1943 that the oil companies would accept the cash offer, and it would take until 1947 for the British-owned Mexican Eagle to settle for cash reimbursements for their seized oil companies' equipment and property in Mexico, after which the Mexicans set up a national oil company but were never able to make enough profits to expand or to pay its workers a decent wage. Had the Russians and the Americans been allowed to do business in 1945, after Hitler's war, there would have been no place under the sun for the old way of doing business with the British, and their skullduggery had started up first thing in the new United Nations that had begun with such bright promise in San Francisco, specifically Dulles' UN Resolution 377. 3 days later, the trap snapped shut. Rising from the snow-drifted valley of the Yalu, surging outward across a desolate sub-zero mountainscape, a massive Chinese onslaught roared down the Korean peninsula for 120 miles, sweeping before it MacArthur's stunned, misaligned armies. When its fury was spent, all North Korea had been reclaimed under the red flag, and MacArthur was again dug in deep in the south. This time, he was confronted not by a thin Korean line that could be turned and enveloped, but by infinite layers of Chinese who measured their wars in decades. Confessions of a Muckraker by Jack Anderson with James Boyden, New York Balanchine Books, Random House, 1979, page 181.